How did Africa, which has a lot of history and natural resources, go from having strong governments in the 16th century to having a lot of different countries today? Africa's history over the past few hundred years is one of strength, innovation, and change, from the rise and fall of empires to the effects of colonization and the fight for freedom. This video will take you on a trip through the important people and events that shaped Africa's future. What can we learn from the past, which was both exciting and difficult? Come with us as we learn about Africa's past from the 1600s to the 1900s. Slavery was not limited to the manufacture of tangible goods such as beads, linens, and copper during the Western commerce that took place between the Americas and Africa, since it stretched beyond that. At the beginning of the 16th century, Africans were being transferred to the newly colonized Americas through the use of force. A total of almost 11 million Africans were taken to the Americas and the Caribbean over the course of 4 centuries, making the volume of slaves that were transported across the Atlantic an unprecedented level. This is despite the fact that slavery had persisted in Africa in a variety of forms. The slave trade, which was driven by the desire to increase economic benefits, reached its pinnacle in the 18th century with the expansion of plantation production in the United States. This trend continued until the middle of the 19th century. The abolitionist movement gathered momentum in the latter half of the 18th century, which coincided with the beginning of a collapse in the slave trade. People who survived the horrific Middle Passage and forced migration transported their cultural practices and ideas to the Americas. These people brought their traditions and beliefs with them. Within this enormous diaspora, several cultures were singled out for special attention. These cultures include the Congo, who hail from the modern-day Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as the Yoruba and Igbo, who hail from the modern-day Nigeria. Those Africans who were sold into slavery brought very few, if any, personal possessions with them. However, subsequent archaeological digs have unearthed early African antiquities, such as beads and shells that date back to the 17th and 18th centuries and were found in the African burial sites in Lower Manhattan, New York. A wide range of cultural manifestations, such as hip roofs that slope and open front porches, are examples of the African influence that may be seen in the Americas. The spiritual beliefs of the Congo, Yoruba, and Dahomean peoples serve as the essential basis for the Vada religion that is practiced in Haiti. Some of the most well-known dishes in Southern American cuisine, such as jambalaya and gumbo, have their origins in African practices of eating. Jazz and blues are 2 examples of musical genres that are a reflection of the merging of European musical traditions and African musical practices. An example of a domu figurine harp that was constructed out of wood, skin, string, and brass rings can be found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. This particular harp was made between the 19th and 20th century. People from the Mangbetu ethnic group in the Democratic Republic of the Congo were the ones who created it. An example of a domu figurine harp that was constructed out of wood, skin, string, and brass rings can be found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. This particular harp was made between the 19th and 20th century. People from the Mangbetu ethnic group in the Democratic Republic of the Congo were the ones who created it. The Europeans were the ones who colonized Africa. Despite the fact that the trade in slaves had been completely outlawed by the late 1800s, European involvement in Africa continued uninterrupted. To be more specific, 7 European nations colonized a significant portion of Africa as a result of their desire to gain more control over the resources of the continent. Through a meeting that took place in Berlin between the years 1884 and 1885, representatives from 14 different European nations came together to discuss the control of European trade and colonization in Africa. France, Belgium, Germany, Britain, Spain, Italy, and Portugal were among the nations that controlled the continent throughout the course of the subsequent 20 years. Others included Portugal. All of the countries on the African continent had been conquered by European forces by the year 1914, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia. Colonialism in Africa brought about unprecedented transformations, including the disruption of social and religious conventions, the disruption of trade routes, and the disruption of local administrative systems. In addition, the colonial era had an impact on the artistic practices of African artists. This was because artists were responding to evolving social and political circumstances, new patronage structures, and technological breakthroughs throughout this time period. The encouragement that Europeans provided to indigenous artists in certain circumstances resulted in the development of new modes of expression or a change in style. In addition, during this time period, many kinds of artistic expression were restricted or simply prohibited because Westerners viewed them as primitive. Despite the fact that African artifacts were brought to Europe as early as the 16th century, it was during the colonial era that these pieces largely entered Western collections and were the foundation of many modern museum collections. A variety of individuals, including military leaders, colonial officials, missionaries, scientists, traders, and others, transported objects from Africa back to the continent as souvenirs or anthropological specimens at various points in time. Following the destruction of the Kingdom of Benin by a British military expedition in the year 1897, thousands of royal art items were removed from the kingdom as part of a war that Britain initiated against one of its colonies. Some of the European nations that had colonies in Africa established ethnographic museums with extensive collections. These museums include the British Museum in London, the Volkerkunde Museums in Germany, the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, Belgium, the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, which is now housed at the Musée du Quai Branly, and other museums. The fledgling discipline of ethnography in the United States, which had no colonial ties to Africa, served as the impetus for the establishment of collections at the Field Museum in Chicago and the American Museum of Natural History in New York City 5. The Brooklyn Museum was the first museum in the United States to exhibit African art as a way to celebrate the freedom of this continent. It is true that the liberation of Ghana in 1957 was the beginning of the African independence struggle, and the deconstruction of South Africa throughout the 1990s was also a significant event. The era of postcolonialism has been challenging, with many countries finding it challenging to attain stability after the end of colonial rule. However, despite the fact that the media regularly focuses political unrest, social unrest, as well as economic and health difficulties, these concerns only represent a piece of the story of Africa's suffering. Modern African artist named Lay Martin art, in spite of the severe political, economic, and environmental conditions that Africa is currently experiencing, the continent has witnessed a significant amount of creative output during the post-colonial era. A great number of artistic traditions that are based on tradition are either flourishing or have been revitalized. As an example of cultural reinvention in Guinea, the resurrection of Dembe performances in the 1990s, which followed decades of persecution by the Marxist government, is a good example. In a manner comparable to this, merino weavers in the highlands of Madagascar have resurrected a textile technique that had been abandoned a century ago. They are manufacturing a kotofaha, which is a silk cloth that is painted with vibrant colors. Since its arrival to the continent in the latter half of the 19th century, photography has seen a rise in popularity, particularly in urban areas. During the period of colonial rule, photographers by the name of Seydou Keita, who operated a portrait studio in Bamako, Mali, laid the groundwork for subsequent generations of photographers who captured the faces of newly independent African countries. It is also essential to discuss the developments that have taken place in contemporary African art. During the time of colonial rule, art schools were established in order to educate local artists, and they usually used Western models as a visual inspiration. There are numerous educational institutions that were established by Europeans, one of which is the Congolese Academy des Arts, which was established by Pierre Romain Desfacieux in the year 1944 in Elizabeth. Its curriculum was designed after that of art schools in Europe, namely in Europe. In a less common occurrence, indigenous Africans such as Chief Ena Onabolu, who is credited with introducing contemporary art to Nigeria beginning in the 1960s, initiated the teaching of moderator work of Art 1 since the middle of the 1900s. An increasing number of African artists have acquired a national identity through their visual expression or have interacted with local customs in unique ways. The Waishan, red clay measuring 50.2 x 33 x 26.7 centimeters, it was created by Magdalene Enyango N. Odundo in 1997 and is currently on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City is the owner of works by a red clay sculpture created by Magdalene Enyango N. Odundo in 1997. It measures 50.2 inches by 33 inches by 26 inches, 07 centimeters. There are a variety of artistic training programs that have resulted in the creation of contemporary African artists. These artists utilize a wide variety of mediums and communicate with audiences both in Africa and around the world through their work. Over the course of the past few decades, contemporary African artists who have received both self-taught and academically trained training have garnered acclaim on a global scale. For example, Magdalene Odundo, a woman who was born in Kenya and is currently residing in England, received her artistic education at both Kenyan and English schools. Her numerous origins, which include traditional vessels from Kenya and Nigeria as well as the Puebloan pottery traditions of New Mexico, are expressed in the burnished ceramic vessels that she produces, which are simply artifacts. Her many origins include the New Mexico Puebloan pottery traditions. The works of contemporary African artists, such as Dan Bosak, provide light on the complex realities of artistic activity in the current world, which is becoming increasingly globalized anxiousness. For more fascinating explorations of history and culture, make sure to subscribe and never miss a new video.